All right, we are back with another wiring video, just showing off the portfolio, some more projects that have been worked on. This one's pretty unique because it's for an ECU that's no longer made anymore, for Adaptronic M1200. So this is for the homie Alec Plante. If you guys know him on Instagram, he shreds, he drifts. I'll kind of go over a couple things. It's just the pinout for every harness gets a whole pinout sheet just in case the customer needs it or to assign any outputs and IOs. But essentially, if we read here, we got a Series 4 equipped with an OEM crank angle sensor, Series 5/6 alternator, Series 6 idle control valve, which he's not going to be using. I recommended it, so I just left it there. Injector dynamic injectors, EV14 style, Series 6 throttle position sensor, electronic boost control, GM intake air temp sensor, and coolant temp sensor, universal ignition coils, so he can go between OEM style coils or something like IGN-1As or whatnot. We got electric fan control here, low and high speed, cluster controlled, so he could retain the coolant cluster function. Fuel pump control, so the ECU will control the factory fuel pump wiring. And we have an external map sensor, particularly a GM3 bar, flex fuel, wipers, and different analog inputs such as fuel pressure and oil pressure. So pretty cool stuff. That's the pinout for the customer. I'll kind of show you guys how this harness all works. So this ECU and any sort of support is pretty much outdated. So I actually sourced all these connectors for the ECU. The Adaptronic website is no more. They got acquired by Haltech and you can't really get this stuff. So I had to kind of make everything from scratch. So as you can see, we got the ECU connectors and that's pretty cool. And I have my own basis for a flying lead harness that I got here. And if we go further into the harness, we have Series 4 chassis to engine harness connection. So this will give 12 volt signal to different parts of the harness and also things such as coolant temp and fuel pump control. And then we have this flying lead here for the customer. This essentially, so he could wire up his wideband, I believe is an Innovate wideband. So it's just one wire and he can do things such as logging and closed loop lambda, which is pretty cool. Very simple, no crazy wiring required. We move further up in the harness over here. We have this connector here. So any sort of connector like this is provided with a female end for one to wire in. So this is a 2-speed wire, 2-speed fan control. So we have that over here. For electric fans, most people run like a Taurus style fan or maybe 2 fans or whatever. So that's available. And then also we do have electronic boost control. This customer wanted to run electronic boost control. You know how that all works. More boost, pretty much holds the wastegate longer so you can get a better boost curve or more boost or more power. This is kind of where all the power comes from on boosted cars for people that are pushing it. And the customer plans on running E85 so you can do this all safely, and I'll get further into that. So this is the magic right here. Kind of a mess, not really. Everything's all labeled on this particular harness for the customer. So to get the elephant out of the room, there's this little wire here that is just kind of chilling. This particular wire is for the coolant temp sensor on the cluster. Now, I didn't wire an end on it because it really depends on the block and series you have. One uses a female style connector and one uses a bullet style connector. So I just left that there, whether he wants to put it in there. I just like to keep all the street functions and all the OEM features working on all my harnesses. Here we have his EV14 style injectors. They're all labeled accordingly. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1 would be primary 1. Or primary front, 2 would be primary rear, 3 would be secondary front, and 4 would be secondary rear. So that is all wired accordingly for the customer. Over here we have a flying lead, so he can just wire up the ground to the keg depending on how he wants to go about that. Very simple, you could just put a ring terminal on there. We have the stock crank angle sensor, so this is all shielded. It's very important that I shield any sort of cam/crank sensor signal on any harness to avoid any ignition breakup issues or to blow up your motor. You do not want that. So this is all fresh wiring. Then we have our ignition sub harness over here. This ignition sub harness will interface with whatever ignition coils he plans on running. This allows him to run, OEM style coils or IGN-1As as mentioned earlier. So I did that per request of the customer, just because he's still planning out certain things. So that's there. We have our TPS plug. So this is for a Series 6. So he has an FD upper intake manifold. So you need a Series 6 TPS connector in order to run that properly. We have a map sensor connector. So this is for a GM 3-bar external map sensor. We also have idle air control valve. As I said, he's not planning on using it, but in the future, if he plans on using it, or he could just repurpose this for an auxiliary output, such as like meth injection or whatever. Over here, we have an IAT sensor. So this is super long. This gives some flexibility depending on where the IAT sensor is located. This is a GM style IAT sensor. Typically, it's very common to run in that case. Over here, we have these connector ends over here. So this is one's for fuel pressure and the other is for oil pressure. And what I have provided for the customer in this case is connector ends to actually install them. So over here, these are the connector ends. The sensor situation is a little weird, so I didn't just wire it up to the particular sensor he was running, since he might change up the sensor or whatever. This will allows him to make a little sub harness so he could run those. And I did provide all the wiring information. It's very simple. To the left, we have green, which is signal ground, middle is signal, and then the pink wire is 5 volts. So that is super awesome, very simple, nothing complicated in that sense. And over here, we have a GM style coolant temp sensor. On Series 4s, Series 5s, and even FDs, there is an M12 by 1.25 GM connector that you can just get from an auto parts store. It's much more fast and reactive, and I usually don't recommend running an OEM style coolant temp sensor. They're just not as fast and reactive, and they're usually just worn out. So in that case, I don't really recommend running them. And lastly, we have wired up a flex fuel connection. So this allows the customer to run things such as E85 and pump gas and create a blend. Since this car is a street car and a drift car, it gives them that flexibility. But overall, that's just some of the work I do. And if you guys are interested, feel free to hit me up. Really happy with how this one turned out. It turned out really good. And I couldn't be any happier with the results. This is definitely a lot of progress from some of my earlier work. So super cool stuff.